Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and today is the 30th day of January 2023. The month of January has flown by. You can see the days are passing by quickly, it seems. So today and yesterday, been a rainy day. Not as much today as a rainy day as it was yesterday. Received over right around an inch of rain where I live at. We've already received approximately 8 inches of rain in the month of January. So what I'm going to be doing tonight, sharing with you again on my Discerning What is True channel, which is on YouTube, also on Odyssey, and also I'm sharing on my personal account being Brant Hunt on Facebook. So let's get into this meat of this book here, One World Order, Socialist Dictatorship by Dr. John Coleman. The ACU, this is page 46, I'm sorry, page 51 of 217 pages here. The ACLU has been in the vanguard of defeminizing women under the guise of women's rights. The ACLU has successfully protected the prime movers of socialism by rushing to their defense whenever they fear the real leaders and purposes of socialism might be exposed. This is a primary purpose of the ACLU, you see. By rushing to the defense, okay, this is the primary purpose of the ACLU. Deflect the attacks on the socialist and intellectual leadership, the reformers with the good intentions and the Harvard law professors in the rear. From the 1920, the modus operandi of the ACLU has remained the same and can better be described by itself. Let me explain what ACLU stands for. It stands for American Civil Liberties Union. Okay, so this is a liberal group. And I don't mean in a freedom group, it's more of a leftist to say. So the American Socialist Union has remained the same and can better be described by itself against those indiscriminate federal, state, and local measures which, through aims at communism, note the exclusion of socialism, threatens the civil liberties of all Americans to make an effective civil rights program the law of the land. So you see what they're doing. This is what they've been doing for now over 100 years in this country. Against both governmental and private pressure groups, censorships of movies, books, plays, newspapers, magazines, radio, and to promote fair procedures in court trials, congressional, and administration hearings. The ACLU left no doubt that it intended to rewrite the Constitution by the legislative route. You see, but they don't have the guts to go through the constitutional amendment deal because they would lose that. You see, that's my pun. Nor can there be any doubt that this important socialist apparatus has changed the face of America. In an interview with Fareed Zakaria of Foreign Affairs, Lee Kuan Yew, former Prime Minister of Singapore, was asked, "What in your view has gone wrong with the American system?" It is not my business, this is quote, it is not my business to tell people what is wrong with their system. It is my business to tell people not to foster their system indiscriminately on societies in which it will not work. You replied, Zagaria then asked, do you not view the United States as a model for other countries? To which Lee responded, but as a total system, I find parts of it, that is the United States, totally unacceptable. Vagrants, unbecoming behavior in public, the expansion of the right of the individual to behave as he pleases has come at the expense of orderly society. In the East, the main objective is to have an orderly society so that everybody can have maximum enjoyments of his freedom. Get it? So this is what this whole individual freedom stuff is all about. It destroys all freedom for everybody. This freedom only exists in an ordered state and not in a natural state of contention and anarchy. The idea of inviolability of the individual in the United States has been turned into dogma. And yet nobody minds when the army goes and captures the president of another state and brings him to Florida and puts him in jail. This was a reference to the bandit action of the former President George Bush kidnapping General Noriega of Panama. Yeah, he also, yeah, interesting. Saria then asks, would it be fair to say that you admire America more than 25 years ago? What, in your view, went wrong? Lee answered, yes, things have changed. I would hazard a guess that it has a lot to do with the erosion of the moral underpinning of society and the dimension of personal responsibility. The liberal intellectual tradition that developed after World War II claimed that human beings had arrived at this perfect state where everybody would be better off if they were allowed to do their own thing and flourish. It has not worked out, and I doubt it ever will. We forgot, folks. They brainwash you. You had it far better than you have it today. Certain bases about human nature do not change. Man needs a certain moral sense of right and wrong. There is such a thing called evil, and it is not the result of being a victim of society. Yes, indeed. This whole victimization stuff is just beyond, it's just crazy. There can be no doubt about the crucial role played by the ACLU in stretching existing rights and inventing rights that do not exist in the Constitution to the extent that the United States today is a virtual state of anarchy. Take as an example the Gay Pride Parade staged in San Francisco on Father's Day on June 19, 1994. The choice of day and date was no accident, folks, but a deliberate, studied insult to do with Christianity. But not just that, folks, the tradition of marriage and family. The parade consisted of lesbians roaring around on motorbikes, naked and semi-naked, so-called dykes on bikes, you see. Men, obscene drag costumes, and hordes of other men with their genitals fully exposed and lopping about as they ran hither and thither. This was a altogether disgusting display of vulgarity on city streets that would never have been tolerated before, and should not have been tolerated then. But let anybody bring up the disgusting parade and perhaps suggest suitable action to curb such ugly, utter banful display in the future, then they will be sure to find the ACLU charging in to protect their civil rights of the most unmoralized, amoral sector of the population. And what has happened simply, in some ways, I'm going to give you a spinoff here. The minority, the small minority, has taken the top position, folks. And I'm not talking about Christianity here neither. That's not what this is about. This is about right and wrong. There's a place, if you want to be naked, you can be naked in your backyard with nobody seeing you. You can be naked in your house. That's your business, period. But not in public, you see. The deplorable parade was praised by the San Francisco Chronicle, which also carries a rave review of a movie about two lesbians falling in love. The paper describes this disgusting piece of immorality and suitable for straits. Thus far have we as a society sunk to the bottom of the socialist cesspool. Fabian socialists have always been great admirers of Karl Marx. They do not really admit to this hero worship, lest the sheep that they so despise should become alarmed. During my 5-year sting of intensive study at the British Museum in London, I examined Marx's economic writings in some depth. I could do this because Karl Marx has spent 30 years studying it in the same British Museum. And some of my mentors knew which books he liked and read the most, told me what they were. When I discovered about the writings was how little of it was original thought. This is common to most of the great socialist thinkers, you see. All of Marx's theories about economic stripped of dense verbiage surrounding them can be boiled down to 7 or 8 basic mathematical equations that I could do when I was in the 8th grade. All that Marx's theories add up to is the precept that capitalists who finance business ventures end up stealing large sums of money from the workers. This completely ignores the real premise that haven't taken all the risk in starting up the venture, that is. The investor is entitled to his profit. That, in essence, is the sum and substance of Marx and his verbalist written theories. Ranking second onto the ACO was the League of Industrial Democracies, LID, founded in 1905, which came out of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. The League was to play an important role in distorting education, industry, and labor. LID was supported by Eleanor Roosevelt all of her life, as did Florence Kelley and Francis Perkins. Eleanor Roosevelt promoted social democracy inside and outside of the organization, along with Francis Perkins, her husband's New York State Commissioner of Labor and great friend of Socialist Justice Harlan Stevens. Morris, M-O-R-R-I-S, Hillquit, served as a LID treasurer from 1908 to 1915. Clavette, the ACLU leader for so long, was always closely affiliated with the League for Industrial Democracy, once calling that period of his socialist career as the happiest days of my life. Morris Hillquit had very early on in his socialist career advocated industrial socialism. Hillquit and Eugene V. Debs, who actually ran as a Socialist Party candidate for president, always followed the London Fabian Society model of not having programs and platforms, but rather using educational institutions as a captive audience, and so inspire students with socialist ideas and philosophies that they would later be able to infiltrate the existing political parties. Yeah, he's working at the top, not at the bottom here. Courses in socialism were discreetly introduced at least in the early 1900s, but by the 1970s, in true Fabian socialist orthodoxy, the process had been considerably sped up in many institutions of learning. It is said that the League of Industrial Democracy, the LID, revitalized American socialism, which in 1900 was flagging. At that point, several prominent members of the elite in American society visited the Fabian socialists in England. Among them were religious leaders, teachers, and politicians. Paul Douglas, who went on to be Senator Douglas, Arthur M. Schlesinger, whose son rose to prominence in the Kennedy and Johnson administration, Melvin Douglas, the actor, and his wife, Helen Douglas, and Walter Ruskenbush, a former minister of the Second Baptist Church of New York. Ruskenbush was a devoted disciple of Ginzel Mazzilli, John Ruskin, Edward Bellamy, and Marx. Mazzini was a world leader of Masonry folks. Ruskin was a self-styled old-school communist who taught at Oxford. Bellamy was the leading socialist in America at that time. This is really important. This is where the foundation is, if you understand. Ruskenbush gave up preaching Christianity for preaching socialist politics, which he tried to indoctrinate in many fellow Baptists as he could reach. The LID was on the list of the United States military intelligence as a subversive organization, but along with many similar socialist and communist organizations, Woodrow Wilson ordered the military to destroy the list it was holding, which was a loss that could not have ever been made again good. The fact that Wilson had no powers under the Constitution that allowed him to give such an order was tossed aside and inconsequential by the socialists in his administration at Harvard and on Wall Street. But it was neither German agents in World War I nor Russian agents in the Cold War era, but the British Fabian socialists who penetrated and permeated every aspect of government, its institutions and presidency itself. That's correct. Totally correct. The enemy is not Germany. Their so-called socialism, neither Russia with their communism, but the British Fabian socialists are the real ones, folks. This is why people cannot get it through their head, you see. Because these are the people who I've shared with you. H.G. Wells is one of them. Huxley and others who felt they didn't feel, even though most of them were well off, would never give any help to poor people, but they felt that the government should be the ones who gave it to them. So they would rob from those who, what we call haves, and give to the have-nots. That's a political science term that we talked about, taking from the haves and giving to the have-nots. That's what socialism is, folks. It's robbery. You see, stealing from those who have. Yeah, the haves can give if they want. I don't have a problem with that. That's part of it. I give to others who don't have. But I also go against this because it's not the government's business to do this. Get it? It's not the government business to do that, folks. And that's the problem. So then they steal from the haves and then give to the have-nots. Education was reorganized in a way that socialism could be advanced. So a great effort was made to capture the student market, of course. When the LUSK committee was investigating New York Rand School, that's RAND School, reference was made to this. We have already called attention to the Fabian Society as a very interesting group of intellectuals who engaged in a very brilliant campaign of propaganda. Apparently, the LUSK committee, LUSK again, was somewhat taken in by the false air of candor that permeated the LID publications, and no violent revolutionary types were allowed to subtly its membership list. The LUSK committee, distracted and looking for communists, just as the United States has been doing and ad infinitum, completely missed the highly subversive and dangerous LID. It never ceased to amaze our observers just how skillful the socialists were able to deflect attention away from themselves by repeatedly referring to the Red Scare and denigrating all efforts to ensure internal security is based on a non-existent communist threat. The real threat has always been the socialists, folks. It is not the communists. They know that the communists would never succeed, folks, ever in the free world. Never. It's little by piece is what socialists do. We're still largely being fooled in the same way in 1994 as was the Lust Committee was in 1920. After World War I, LID teamed up with several prominent socialist organizations in the United States. Among them was the ACLU, the Federated Press, and the Garland Fund, that's Garland, which was cited by military intelligence as being kindly disposed towards funding communism and some decidedly socialist organizations. Robert Moss Lovett, Lovett, of the ACLU, was a director in all aforementioned bodies, including Protestants and other American United for the Separation of Church and State. The LID members were engaged to disavow socialism in public and disavow their parent, the Fabian Society, founded by Sidney and Beatrice Webb. This was a standard socialist practice: deny, deny, deny. When one of the Fabian Society's most honored members was asked if he was a socialist, that is John Kenneth Galbraith, Galbraith, replied, "Of course not." During World War II, when it was obvious that Roosevelt would do anything to get the United States committed to the war against Germany, LID felt it expedient to change its stance. In 1943, published a statement that said, that is, the LID had as its goal increasing an understanding of democracy through education and not making war. Interesting. Their aim was good, folks. What LID did not say was that democracy it had in mind was what Karl Marx called scientific socialist democracy. That is, that the United States was a republic and not a democracy, was merely waved aside just by suffrage, by stealth, and by cunning. LID became the leading socialist body in the United States, dedicated to the downfall of the republic. The history of LID shows that it played a key role in bringing socialist reform to the front burner in both the Wilson and Roosevelt's administrations. When Roosevelt was governor of New York, he appointed Francis Perkins to be his industrial commissioner. Why would you need someone? That doesn't make any sense. Industrial commissioner. We give the remarkable achievements of Perkins in the chapters on women's socialists. Perkins called on LID economist Paul H. W. Douglas to draft an unemployment relief program, which was adopted by the Governor Roosevelt. You see it here? One of her collaborators was Dr. Isidore Lubin, Lubin, a dedicated socialist who, along with Perkins, pushed for preference treatment for the Soviet Union, advice that Roosevelt was quick to accept. Perkins and Lubin began the long process based upon British Fabian socialist strategy of transforming the United States from a capitalist into a socialist state via a welfare state, folks. That's what took place under the administration of President Johnson in the 60s. We talked about it in political science. It was then simply was guns and butter. Guns were simply as we were fighting supposedly communism, which reality we weren't. And the butter was for the home front, for people who needed all kinds of help, who a lot didn't want it. Including this plan was the National Health Insurance Plan. Hear that? Lifted straight out of the Soviet Union. It is worthy of note that health care reform, nationwide old age pensions, and unemployment insurance were all part of the plan to alter the structure of the United States, in which Social Security was no small part, that is. In 1994, we have another female socialist, Hillary Clinton, latching onto the term health care reform. It's always about health care, folks. And actually, health care is an excuse. What I mean by that, you need to be responsible for your health, not the government, period. You need to eat your right kind of foods, and not drink and smoke, do all kinds of crazy things that actually do not do harm to your body. But if you choose that, that's your decision, you see. You have to be responsible in life, you see. That's not in here, but I'm just sharing this because I think it's key. When in fact, it was the term used by Prestonian Martin Mann, M-A-N-N, one of the most devoted female socialists on the American scene, who in turn had borrowed it from the British Fabian socialist leader Sidney Webb. The phrase was a masterpiece of applied psychology on a level with another piece of applied psychology intended to deceive. The Social Security Act, invented in England and brought to this country by Father Ryan, the Fabian Socialist Blueprint, was then adapted for American conditions by Prestonia Martin, as we find in her book, Prohibiting Poverty, championed by Eleanor Roosevelt. If you know anything and awareness of this, folks, they tried it in England for some time, and it was a flop. They were actually destroying their own economy. That's why they looked to the United States to bail them out. That's the truth. That's the truth. Most don't want to hear this, but that's the truth. LID never claimed any credit for its behind the scenes in the endeavors of Perkins and Martin, as indeed it never claimed that Felix Frankfurter, who was a judge, Supreme Court judge, was one of his own very own. The extensive damage to the United States done by the LID is remarkable, given the relative smallness of the group. This is precisely the way Fabian socialists work. Blend into the background, infiltrate all the government, important decision-making bodies, and then promote, always from the background, a rising political star to initiate socialist design programs. This is the way socialism worked in the 1920s and still works in the way in the United States, which is how the socialists and their Marxist communist allies came perilously close to taking over the United States in the 1920s and early 1930s. You're perfect examples of socialists and the Marxist communist allies. Near a perfect example of socialism working through rising politicians were Wilson, Roosevelt, Johnson, Bush, and now President Clinton and his wife, Hillary Clinton. Clinton was selected by the British Fabian Society, folks, but the job of pumping him up, which just goes back to Tavistock. That's right, Tavistock. Pumping him up was given as secret in the socialist Pamela Harriman, Harriman. One-term President Clinton had the task of rushing socialist programs of far-reaching and devastating consequences into law. His successes by mid-1994 included the largest income tax increase in the world, one world government trade agreements, and possibly national health reform. 3 times before, British Fabian socialists had changed the face of America by using leadership groups and advisors to the president and via the courts to achieve socialist objectives. Left to the LID to supply the personal Perkins and Roosevelt needed to implement the New Deal. More than a passing interest is that the New Deal was a carbon copy of the British Fabian socialist book. The fourth drive to socialize America has come with the Clinton presidency. One of the greats of LID was Walter Reuther, Reuther. But in typical socialist fashion, Reuther chose to deny that he was a socialist. In a Face the Nation interview in 1953, Reuther was pointedly asked about his socialist background. He trotted out the standard socialist excuse. And when I was very young and I was very foolish, and I got out very quickly, for which I am very thankful. But the truth was, far from that. Reuther had in fact served on a committee of LID, of which he had been a member since the early 1940s. In 1949, he was honored guest at the Fabian Socialist Dinner Party in London. See, the socialists do this really well. They always point to the communists, you see, in some ways. And so that's where all the attention is shown because the media goes that way. So we got to deal with the communists while they work in the background, always. They're like termites, so to speak. They gradually begin to destroy the foundation of this country, little piece by piece by piece, as wood is eaten in a house that destroys its foundation. LID members played a leading role in pushing socialist programs through the Senate, and their effect on schools knew no boundaries. Theodore Ted Sorensen, S-R-E-N-S-O-N, who went on to be a key player in the Kennedy administration, was a lifelong socialist who got his appointment through LID Senator Paul Douglas. Other United States senators who had qualified socialism with LID were Senator Ledman, Senator Humphrey, Senator Neuberger, and Senator Morris, Morris was from the conservative state of Oregon at that time. To the list can be added Senator Jacob Javits and Philip Hart, although they vigorously deny it to a man. In 1950, former Attorney General Francis Bidler, B-I-D-D-L-E, a former chairman for Americans for Democratic Action, ADA, successor to LID, named them as known members of LID and its successor, the ADA. So the LID is no longer, it's now the Americans for Democratic Action. As evidence of Javin's Senate voting record, I think he was from the state of New York, as well as I recollect, in the 70s, but I might be wrong, showed that he supported LID and ADA in 82 out of 87 socialist measures on which he voted. Of Eastern European parents who settled on the Lower East Side of New York in the Garment District, Javits joined LID in his early adult years and became one of LID's highest prized speakers. While staunchly denying any connection with socialism, his personal beliefs in connection with socialist groups like LID, nevertheless, Javits was the keynote speaker of the 1952 LID sponsored seminar under the title, Needed a Moral Awakening in America. Non-socialist Walter Reuther, who attended the function, was studious, avoided discussing corruption and labor while vigorously attacking employee, corporations, and business in general. Congressional Record Senate, October 1962, carried a long list of socialists prominent in government, health and education, women's rights movement, religion, trade unions, you name it. The list contains the names of more than 100 professors and education of some of the nation's most prestigious colleges and universities. The list named of more than 300 members and former members of LID who had spread out and infiltrated every branch of government, law, teaching, foreign policy advisors, churches, and so-called women's rights organizations. When LID underwent a name change to America for Democracy Action, ADA, many former LID members could be found in the ADA membership list. The Intercollegiate Socialist Society, the ISS, which preceded the LID, opened doors to universities and gave opportunities to spread socialist programs among impressionable students. It was the hidden socialist agenda that was to change the face of education in the United States. None of this was apparent at birth of the Fabian Socialist enterprise. The first ISS meeting was held at Peck's Restaurant in New York on September 12, 1905. Those in attendance included Colonel Thomas Wentworth, Clarence Darrow, D-A-R-R-O-W, Morris Hillquit, and two young socialist authors, Upton Sinclair and Jack London. The two authors were enthusiastic socialists who went across the country preaching the Fabian socialist gospel at universities and socialist clubs. Another notable of somewhat rougher hue who attended the Peck's restaurant dinner party was William Z. Foster, who went on to play a leading role in the Communist Party of the United States of America. Foster's love of Karl Marx has been amply demonstrated for a number of years, not revealed until 25 years later, was the true purpose of the dinner party. It was, in fact, the first meeting of the American Fabian Society. This took place in 1905, people. Hillquit will best be remembered as the driving force behind the American Socialist Party formed in 1902. 2 years later, the Socialist Party gained 400,000 votes in the election. That's pretty sizable votes here, folks. Mostly from garment trade workers who had flocked to the United States from Russia in the early 1890s, bringing with them a assorted gaggle of revolutionaries and anarchists. Yes, there's a book here I have also speaks of what took place after the 1848 failure of trying to overthrow the governments of Western Europe, that they were allowed to go to Switzerland and eventually they were allowed to come to the United States. And they supported hugely the man named Abraham Lincoln to become president of the United States. Yet, in spite of its ugly revolutionary face, the Socialist Party of America attracted an astounding number of the elites from the top drawers of New York society. The Fabian Socialists and British advised caution, making haste so hastily would bring disaster, and so it was that the party was quietly disbanded. As the London Fabian Society Secretary Edward R. Pease, P-E-A-S-E, he wrote a book by the Fabian Society. He does a history of it. Might want to look into that. Put it, European countries with their great capitals have developed national brains. America, like the lower organism, has ganglia for various purposes in various parts of the gigantic brain. Pace was from the elite in the Fabian Society who could not abide America, having never forgiven the colonists for having inflicted so severe a defeat on the armies of King George III. In spite of this studied insult, a number of prominent Americans went to London and signed on with the Fabian Socialists. The long-range objectives of the British Fabian Society relative to the United States has still to be defined and developed. A president who would be wide open to socialist ideas had yet to be found and appointed, so that the well-concealed socialist techniques of gaining power via the surreptitious route could be implemented. As Ramsay MacDonald has said, the United States would be very difficult to socialize, but not impossible. The main stumbling block was, of course, the Constitution. Coupled with that was the huge size of the country and the 6 different racial groups with widely diversified religious beliefs. Education and good paying jobs, he was deemed, were 2 other hurdles that had to be surmounted. As Webb put it, motherhood and apple pie stood in the way of the ambitious promoters of socialism. I'm going to say that again, folks, because it's critical. Motherhood, which is speaking about family, and apple pie, which means simply is that somewhat well and independent. London ordered the Socialist Party to disband and fade away to regroup under another name at the time better suited for its methods to guarantee success. Forming a political party was not on the socialist agenda. The ISS model of leagues and societies was to be followed. It was by suffrage that they hoped to eventually co-opt existing political parties, but never again would they try to form a party of their own. So in 1921, the League of Industrial Democracy, that is LID again, and ISS was founded and became the British Fabian Society's socialist headquarters in the United States. So actually 16 years later. One of the subtlest ways devised by American socialists to hide their intentions and their tracks was to appoint socialist professors as presidential policy makers. Now, this goes along with the CFR too. This all goes along with what Tavistock. These are brilliant books, folks. These are brilliant books to put it together for you, if you want to see and what we're in for here in this country, because this country's a mess. a complete mess. Okay? All you got to do is look at your dollar right now and see how much value it has. Okay? The technique began with Wilson and has continued ever since. So the CFR, Council for Foreign Relations, which is a stepchild of the RIIA, Britain. This is all British, folks. This is all British. It's not American here. You see what I'm saying? This is not an American idea. This is a British idea to control its once colony, but do it through stealth. Supposedly they lost the war between us. Or did they? Did they? And then said to themselves, let's work a different way to get our colonies back. So the professor policymakers seldom announced their agenda, instead wrote position papers which they signed. Position papers had a strictly limited circulation, which kept the general public right out of the picture. Outside the circles of professors were often notable who play a major role in the Wilson presidency. Of these, Walter Lippmann stood head and shoulders above the rest. The British trained Fabian socialists was ranked their #1 apostle in the United States, who together with Mandel House had fashioned the 14 points, the points that Wilson takes credit for, but reality is not him. The first attempt by American presidents to shape a new world order. It is generally recognized that Wilson's war speech, delivered to the Congress of the United States on April 6, 1917, rang down the curtain on the old order, forcing the United States to take the first step down the long socialist to slavery. Wilson laid the foundation of lies on which American socialism was to be built. Americans are the most lied to people on earth. Since Wilson came on the political scene, and of course, even before that, the whole socialist structure consisted of lies upon lies upon lies. One of the biggest lies is that we belong to the United Nations. Other lies say abortion is legal, that school busing and so-called gun control is legal. The GATT, the NAFTA, and the Gulf War, Waco, FEMA, King George Bush raids on Panama and kidnapping of the head of state, and Mandela's role, that is rule in South Africa. People put this guy up, this Mandela guy. It's another lie. This guy is not bad dude, folks. Bad. Rule of South Africa are but the tip of the enormous icebreaker of laying upon layer of socialist lies. Perhaps one of the most singular of his big lies is that socialism strives to better the lot of the common people, and unlike capitalism. Socialism are not interested in personal wealth. Another lie. Socialists are always preaching about the evils of capitalism. Yeah, that's what they teach about. It's always putting down something. But they don't have a better deal, folks. They don't. They have a rotten deal. But a quick look at some of the leading socialists quickly reveals that the leadership is drawn from most elite elements of our society. People using socialist cause to feather their own nests. That's what it's about. They hoodwink you. Nothing was too base and no cesspool too deep to plumb for Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his family in the pursuit of money. You know, the Delaney's, that is Roosevelt's Mary Sarah Delaney, made a fortune out of the opium trade. Did you know that? One of Roosevelt's closest advisors, Bernard Baruch, Baruch, and his partner had monopoly on the copper industry that enabled Baruch to make millions upon millions of dollars out of World War I, while the common man was dying by the millions in the mud and blood of the trenches in France. Yes. You don't need to go fight any wars, folks. You're not saving anybody. You're dying for a worthless cause. Roosevelt was on the board of the International Bankers Association up to that time, and then he became governor of New York. During his tenure as a banker, he put security loans for European nations amounting to billions of dollars at a time when the American worker was struggling to pay off mortgages, and later during the Depression years to find a job. Roosevelt was a consummated socialist liar, up there with the best of them. He didn't tell the American people that the money would go to the bankers whose factories would churn out goods to sell on the American markets, thanks to the abolition of tariff bearers by his predecessor, Woodrow Wilson. It's estimated that 12 million men lost their jobs thanks to Wilson and Roosevelt's assault on our trade barriers designed to protect American jobs. That's what it's all about, folks. That's what it's all about. That's why NAFTA was a critical blow to this country. And if you look at the statistics, ever since the 1990s, this country has been going downhill very fast. There are hardly any jobs here, the manufacturing jobs, who make something, folks, not assemble something. I mean, make something. Our glaring examples of thousands of Roosevelt's big lies is found on pages 9832-9840 of the Congressional Record, Senate, that is, May 25th, 1935, and owing to his announcement to the convention that he was for the Democratic platform 100%. It was hardly feasible that the people would understand if he immediately, with his subservient Congress, reduced the tariffs, custom duties on import and agricultural products, and ancillary manufacturing goods with 12 million men out of work. So he and his big bankers' friends and big business, meaning the committee of 300 companies, immediately conceived the idea of starting the NRA, the so-called National Recovery Act, better known today as the National Ruin Act, RUIN. It was reported that Bernard Baruch and his family established 1,800 factories in foreign countries, and the Republican tariffs were a little too high for them to make our markets with cheap foreign labor to satisfy their big money ideas. So why not, under the guise of war and depression, forced upon the people of the National Racketeer Association, the NRA, and place Barney Baruch's partner, Brigadier Crackup Johnson, in charge of seeing that the prices were raised to the levels of 1928, while at the same time settling the prices of agriculture between 1911 and 1914. The farmer would not notice disparity if they did, since under their circumstances he controlled the newspapers, the radio, the movies, every avenue of information of people with taxpayers' money, filled the ears with propaganda he desired. Roosevelt, the American socialist leader, and his international banker friends, aided by sedition, committed by the Federal Reserve, played with the lives of the people of the nation, and willfully brought on the 1922 recession, actually. And then eventually, in the 1922 recession, this is where farmers who could no longer pay their mortgages on land. They fooled these people by investing in the stock market, and eventually they lost it all in the 1929 Wall Street crash. World War II and beyond. Roosevelt desired greater power as president than his present power-mad predecessor Wilson enjoyed. Oh, yes, he was definitely one. You know, he ran 4 times and he succeeded 4 times too. He was in power from 30, I'm trying to think of the name, 32 to 45. I think that's right. Don't hold me to that. I'm trying to remember the names to see, you know, it's every 4 years. But anyway, no, that's the reason why there's an amendment that no one now can run and be, you know, you can run 2 times and be for 8 years. He was supposed to be for 16 years because he won 4 times 4 equals 16. I don't know how he did it. I really don't. But he lied through his teeth all the time. Although the American people did not know it, and millions still do not know it, Wilson engineered the United States into World War I, and his unelected advisors, simply Mandel House, set the stage for World War II. Roosevelt made quite sure that the process of the international banks lending billions to European powers to start wars was continued. Why did we ever fight in those wars in Europe, folks? It made no sense at all. Did anybody attack us in World War I? No, but except one deal. Oh, that's right. That ship that was set up to do that. I don't know if there was even 1,000 people died in it. Same thing. You look at it, folks. Roosevelt set up Japan. Why did they move the naval deal from San Diego to Pearl Harbor? Makes no sense unless you want the Japanese to attack it. According to documents made available to me in the British Museum, Lord Beaverbrook, the great British Fabian socialist, practically used the White House as his Washington office, showing Roosevelt how to pour billions and billions of dollars into Germany to finance Hitler's rise to power. That's correct. Anthony Sutton talks about that, folks. Wilson showed no scruples in placing overly avowed socialists in key positions in his administration, from where they were able to do the maximum to the cause of socialism in the United States. Fred C. Howell, Howe, one of the Wilson socialist appointees, was made Commissioner of Immigration in New York. His favorite pastime was to release seditionists and anarchists being held at the port of New York pending deportation. In other words, he came in, they were supposed to be deported, and instead, he turned them back around and they came back into the country. Another ex officio House appointed was Walter Lippmann as secretary of Brainstorm Group put together to make up possible war aims and reasons why the United States should get into World War I. It was Lippmann, Lippmann, who invented the slogan, "Peace without victory." That's an oxymoron statement, isn't it? Because his whole intention was to get us into war, not peace, which became the basis of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The appointments of scandalmonger Ray Stanton Baker as a confident as correspondent to Wilson at the Treaty of Versailles talks was another of those crucial appointments. It was said that Baker was chiefly responsible for making Wilson so dependent on the British Fabian Society that he was unable to make any decisions of his own at the Paris Peace Conference. Without first consulting Cindy Webb, founder of the Fabian Society, Graham Wallas, Wallas, Bertrand Russell, and George Landsberg. It was this group that constantly talks of Wilson administration as Democratic administration. Baker's dispatches to Wilson in Washington deliberately referred to your Democratic administration. The Paris Peace Conference, founded on the Constitution, some 59 enlightened senators, fully aware of the intentions of the socialists, refused to pass the League of Nations Treaty. You know how close that is, folks? 41 were in favor of it. That's pretty close. 18 people. To take that 9 away from the other group and add, then you got someone to Speaker of the House. Speaker of the Senate. Recognize it as a one world document that sought to put the League above the United States Constitution. At that junction, that's what's going on, folks. The Constitution is no longer seen with pride. Everything is stepped on. House said to have told Cindy Webb that the only way to get around the United States Constitution was to permeate all future United States administration with key socialists who would take bipartisan approach to matters of major consequences. Ever since these words were spoken, bipartisan approach became a euphemism for a socialist approach to matters of vital consequences to the American people. They've sold you out, folks. They destroyed you. I doubt 1 in 1,000 knows what this is about. I doubt 1 in 100,000. They brainwash you. In order to breathe life into a new bipartisan idea, House held a dinner party at the Majestic Hotel in Paris on May 9, 1919, for selected Fabians and American socialists. Invited guests include Professor James Shotwell, Robert Lanston, as Wilson's Secretary of State, John Foster, and Allen Douglas, D-U-L-L-E-S, Taster Bliss, and Christian Herter, H-E-R-T-E-R, who was later to replace Mao Tse-tung in power in China. On the British side, John Maynard Keynes, which is an idiot of all time, we're following his stupid, quote-unquote, economic policies that have destroyed this country also. He's reverent in all colleges these days, folks. Arno Toynbee and R.W. Tontley, all leading practitioners of the Fabian Socialists, and its standard bearers also attended. The group said that to get around the United States Constitution, it would be necessary to set up an organization in the United States under the direction of RIIA, which is the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The American branch was to be called the Institute of International Affairs. Its mandate, given by its London parent, was to facilitate the scientific study of international questions. The Fabian International Bureau was to act as advisors to both the RIIA and its American cousin, which in 1921 changed its name to the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. These three institutions were set up with three main purposes in mind: do an end run around the United States Constitution, to use these organizations to influence and deceive the United States Congress and the public. 3, to divide opposition to socialist cause in the House and Senate by the subterfuge of bipartisan study committee. 4, to destroy the separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government, as recommended by Professor Harold, H-A-R-O-L-D, Lasky, L-A-S-K-I. Mandel House was the originator of the fireside chats, an essential propaganda tool widely used by Roosevelt, and he suggested most of the socialist cabinet appointees. In many instances, he consulted with Professor Charles W. Eliot of Harvard, that hotbed of socialism which had played such a crucial, if secret, role in our history. This is not surprising given the fact that Harvard was totally dominated by Fabian socialists, Harold Lasky, whose frequent lectures at Harvard set the tone for heavily socialist-leaning teaching methods. Much of the view held by House appeared in the New Republic, a magazine much favored by American socialists, including Wilson himself. That magazine still published, folks. And guess what? Many Republicans, many so-called conservatives, read that magazine. House had many socialist intimates among the socialist register. One of them was Joseph Phelps, F-E-L-S, was prevailed upon by House to lease 500 English pounds to Lenin and Trotsky on one occasion when they were stranded in London before they met with Lord Alfred Milner. Baruch once said House had a hand in every cabinet appointment and all other important appointments. This was indeed an understatement, folks. It's believed that Wilson was fully aware of the activities of the socialist Nina Nitsch, spelled N-I-N-A, Nitsch, N-I-T-Z-E, who served as the chief paymaster for German spies operating in the United States. That didn't seem to bother Wilson or House any more than it was later to affect the judgment of President Kennedy and Johnson, who appointed Nina's brother, Paul Nitsch, as Secretary of the Navy in both administration and chief spokesman at various disarmament conferences. Nitsch is known to have tipped the balance of power in favor of Russia at each and every one of his disarmament conferences, at which time he represented the United States. Another traitor. We don't know this, you see. We need to know it now. Again, according to documents in the British Museum, the financing of the Hitler was done via the Warburg family. You remember that, Paul Warburg. Family on both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe, particularly through the Socialist Mendelssohn Bank of Amsterdam. You remember that, don't you? That one time New York City was once known as New Amsterdam. Bank of Amsterdam, that is in Holland, and Schroeder Bank in London and Frankfurt, Germany. While the same bank handled the Hitler's financial scheme through its New York banks. The transactions were monitored by the Committee of 300 legal firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, whose senior partner was Alan Douglas of the notorious Dulles family. The Dulles brothers rode herd over the Senate and State Department to ensure that the sending votes of some who perchance might stumble upon the arrangements contracted in hell would be smothered before they could alert the nation. These kinds of financial arrangements were common also in the run-up to the World War II. I came across some documents in the British Museum of London during my 5-year study period relating to the way the socialists work both sides of the fence. Yes, they do, the Republican side and the Democrats. Telegrams sent by the German ambassador in Washington to his home office superiors in Britain stated that from 1915, J. William Byrd Hale, Hale, was one of the very own, being employed by the German Foreign Office at a salary of $15,000 per year. That's a lot of money over 100 years ago, folks. Hale, one of the inner circles at Turtle Bay, an exclusive summer colony wherein resided the elite of the American socialists. Among them were Professor Robert Lovett and a large number of other Harvard Law School professors. House lived close by in Manchester. All were described by adoring press of the time as polished products of Harvard and Groton, Groton. But the press was also blinded by these glamorous persons that it failed to state that they were also socialists out of the top drawer of the Fabian American Society. Lovett adored the works of self-styled old-school communists John Ruskin and William Morris. Hale, that is Hale, is a dedicated Christian socialist, made his mark with Wilson in Mexico while orchestrating the theft of Mexican oil for his top socialist colleagues. And we've dealt with that already, Diplomacy by Deception, in his book, for a full account of this scandalous robbery of Mexican people. This is all about rich people stealing. This is all about them. They don't give a damn about anybody, folks. It transpired that Hales actually represented the German Foreign Office until June 23rd, 1918. This while thousands of American citizen militia soldiers were dying for the cause of freedom. Thereafter, this Christian socialist went to Germany as a correspondent for the American Press Service. His much slanted pro-socialist reports figured prominently in newspapers of the period, which can be found in the archives of the British Museum. Though these transactions, the elites of the socialist world grew fat and sleek. Not that there was anything new in this disgusting arrangement. In the run-up to the Civil War, and it was during its entirety, the communists and socialists made huge strides in America. They did. In fact, not mentioned in our history books at all. We'll go through that book. I have it here. We're going to read it. And kept well hidden from the public in a massive Hollywood about this, the most tragic of all wars. A common thread runs through the Fabian socialist movement and passionate desire to pull down and destroy everything. This is confirmed in pages 4594, 4595 in the Congressional Record, February 23rd, 1927, under the title General Deficit Bill. This page in our history delineates the socialists and the communists and their efforts to tear down the Confederate Republic of the United States of America. There is plenty of information how the socialists cooperated with their communist brothers in the booklet called Key Men in America. Key Men of America. Socialism is world revolution much more than Socialism is world revolution much more than was communism, only at a slower pace and on a more sedate level. But the revolution desired by the socialists in the same spiritual anarchy, destruction of 19 centuries of Western civilization, scattering of traditions, and an end to Christianity. If this is doubted by the real readers, then the reading of Franklin D. Roosevelt's book, On Our Way, will convince the skeptics that socialism differs only from communism in method. It's the same goal. Let's go back to Antonio. This is my statement here. Antonio Gramsci, who is an Italian, who was thrown in prison under the Mussolini government of Italy, discovered a way to actually destroy this country. It wasn't militarily, folks. That was what we always have been told. It's a Trojan horse. And that Trojan horse was to destroy our belief systems, our culture, everything, to destroy the foundation. And with that, he passed away at a pretty young age, but some people got his prison's notebook. And that's where the Frankfurt School started. And that Frankfurt School was in Germany, at Frankfurt, Germany, that is, until Hitler threw it out because it didn't fit in his agenda. And then they went to Tavistock. That is a place that has no government. It has no government money whatsoever at that time. And it was set up early 1900s, probably 1910. They already had enormous effect upon Woodrow Wilson too to get us involved in World War I within that short period. Tavistock Institute is one of the worst organizations on this planet, folks. It is the worst because it works in a silent mode and no one knows anything about it. It's a psychological destruction of this country in many ways. Rawlings Reeves is the one who took over it, and he lived to be, I think, in the 1970s. You need to read Tavistock Institute. You really do. It's online. I've already provided for you guys out here on Facebook. Let's continue. Bolshevism was the violent, radical experiment that tried to rid Russia of Christianity. In the United States, other more subtle means are being employed, such as banning of prayer in schools, the so-called separation of church and state, and the classrooms where myriads of socialist teachers are brainwashed students in a manner fit to promote the silent revolution the socialists are carrying out. The Bolsheviks, the Marxists, the socialists all have the same common purpose, folks, and they go hand in hand with liberalism, pacifism, tolerance, progressives, moderates, peace, democratic, peoples, and suffrage issues to dissemble and disguise the true purpose of socialism. Man, this is a great book, folks. This is an excellent work. Someone has paid their life to share this with you. Dr. John Coleman. And as far as I know, he's still alive, but he's an old man. He's 25 years older than I am. So that means that I'm 62, so he's approximately 87 or 88 years old. I don't know where he lives, and really I don't care to know that. Continue. These terms are intended to dupe the unwary so that socialism not be associated with revolution, but the purpose of socialism and Bolshevism are the same. The destruction of civilization built upon 19 centuries of tradition and Christianity. And I'm not agreeing with Christianity, folks, but I am saying simply is part of the foundation of the West. This is a mold or a termite that eats through the foundation of countries, and it's destroyed them. And they've almost got what they want. 1, the goals of socialism are the abolition of government. 2, the abolition of patriotism. 3, the abolition of property rights. While the communists would banish it outright, the socialists choose the steadily sneaky course of taxing private property rights out of existence. 4, the abolition of inheritance. Again, the communists would banish it outright, the socialists by means of inheritance tax laws. 5, abolition of marriage and the family. 6, abolition of religion, especially Christianity. 7, destruction of national sovereignty of countries and national patriotism. Wilson knew of these aims, yet he did not recoil from them, not from becoming a tool of the international socialists, embracing American socialist programs with enthusiasm, for which needed powers not granted to him by the United States Constitution. Are you aware that Woodrow Wilson, dad, was a pastor? He was a pastor in the Southern Presbyterian Church, the church that broke off of the Presbyterian Church before then. It broke off during the war between the states. He pastored in a church that I went to in Augusta at one time in the 1860s, maybe a little after. Then he pastored a church in Columbia, South Carolina, which was another First Presbyterian Church, a more conservative part of the Presbyterian Church. And yet Woodrow Wilson seems to abandon everything that his parents taught him. And I'm not saying I agree with Christianity and such, but this guy had, and I like to study more about who Woodrow Wilson is, because frankly, it seems as though he was so enamored by attention that Colonel House gave him. and would give him answers. And yet he didn't have any common sense to make the right decisions at all. He chose always bad because he was progressing. He thought he was doing such and such right. He eventually figured it out. He says in his latest part when he was dying, and I'm trying to remember it just I ruined my country. And he did. You've never, most people don't know this. Nobody knows what I'm sharing with you folks. Embracing American social programs with enthusiasm, for which he needed powers not granted to him by the U.S. Constitution, Wilson was not averse to using the sly methods of socialism to attain his goals. For instance, he was successful in getting the United States in World War I by classifying it as a patriotic duty to defend America, which was never at any time threatened by Germany. Never. It never was. Get that in your head. Wilson was not the first power-hungry president, although he was the first openly socialist one, though. The dubious distinction of power grabbing belongs to President Lincoln, who was the first to come out with proclamations now called executive orders. President George Bush, that is, followed right along Roosevelt's footsteps, using the same unconstitutional methods to feather his nest, diving into every cesspool where there was money to be made at the cost of the American people. A so-called Republican, Bush did as much to harm the common people of the United States as Roosevelt had done, and Wilson had done before him. Beware of party labels, folks. George Washington called political parties baneful, and unnecessary, and modern history shows them to be divisive. Both political parties stink. They're not what you think they are. Tyrants have succeeded because of political parties and their divide and rule mentality. The Constitution of the United States provides for impeachment of men like Wilson, Roosevelt, and Bush. In fact, patriotic Congressman Henry Gonzalez filed 6 articles of impeachment against Bush. Did you know that? During the Gulf War. The media didn't tell you that, did they? But partisan politics stood in the way of Article 2, Section 4, Article 1, Section 3 being used to bring George Bush to justice. There were a multitude of causes to impeach Bush, not the least being his failure to adhere to the Constitution and attain a properly drawn-up declaration of war. But you have to understand something here, folks. You see, that was Johnson also did that. Next, the unconstitutional forgiveness of Egypt's debt of $7 billion, his bribery of Syria and other nations who joined the Desert Storm against the nation of Iraq. His continual misuse of all 3 branches of service in violation of the Constitution and calling himself the commander-in-chief of the armed service, which he was not, is also impeachable. It's worth repeating that the Gulf War was illegal. It was fought without a declaration of war in defiance of the Constitution. Congress, largely conditioned by party sentiments, tried to write up a type of resolution, not a declaration, though, of war, that purported to give the symptoms of legality to Bush's action. But Congress added insult to injury to the American people in that they made the mistake of writing up their version of declaration of war in consonance with the United Nations mandate given Bush, and not in consonance with the Constitution, which reveals just simply is that the United Nations is truly the power, not the United States. This was absolutely wrong. The United States never constitutionally joined the United Nations, and a declaration of war by this one world government body cannot be on the same instrument or even associated with a declaration of war by the Congress. Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution denies and or limits the power of Congress to legislate. Congress does not have the absolute power to legislate and can only do in consonance with the Constitution. The neither fish nor fowl resolution passed by Congress behind which Bush tried on to take a semblance of legality for his illegal war was outside the pale and the ken of the United States Constitution and did not constitute a declaration of war. Analysis of the way Congress voted shows dramatically that almost to a man, the hundreds of socialists infested the House and Senate voted for Bush to allow Bush to continue his floundering of the Constitution. Bush should have been impeached and tried. If the Constitution was followed in such proceedings, there is no doubt he would have been jailed, as he rightly deserves. The powers of the president are contained in Section 2 of the United States Constitution. Actions not in Section 2 are exercise of arbitrary power. The socialists, starting with House, Frankfurter, and Brandeis, and followed by Kassenbaum and etc., have it that the three branches of government are co-equal. This is a falsehood, just another of the lies that go to make up the huge iceberg upon which the nation will be wrecked unless we alter that course. Professor Harold Lasky was the chief instigator of this lie, viewed as the first step towards weakening the separation of powers as mandated by the U.S. Constitution. The three branches of government are not co-equal and never have been. We've been taught that, folks. I have. The House and Senate created the judicial branch, and the House and Senate never intended to give them equal powers. Of course, if this ever became known, the socialist outflanking of the Constitution by the legislative route would be thrown out the window. Perhaps the American people will wake up to the way in which judges gerrymandered the Constitution before it is too late. I'm beginning to doubt that, folks. Congress has superior powers, one of which is through the purse. Another simple way is to get rid of socialist judges is to enforce Article 3, Section 1, which says that judges may not receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. What this means to the U.S. Supreme Court, judges cannot, by law, be paid in debased money, and better example of that is the debased money of the Federal Reserve notes, commonly and mistakenly called dollars, is not to be found. What a blow it would be to the inheritors of the Kelly doctrine if we, the people, close the Supreme Court down for lack of money that is not debased. Wilson should likewise have been impeached for sure. His mad grab for power was at the instigation of Mandel House, the arch socialist enemy of the people of the United States, who worked in the dark his sinister, scurrilous, evil plans to overturn and destroy the Confederate Republic of the United States of America. To this end, House had Wilson appoint all manners of elite socialists to key positions. What a gullible idiot. The goals of American socialists have been well concealed in the past, particularly in the period leading up to World War II. That socialists had achieved many of their objectives is clear. They did it by the formation of movements designed to break down the morals of America. As witnessed the startling growth of free love, loves without responsibility, folks, which has thus far cost the lives of more than 26 million murdered babies sanctioned by the Supreme Court pro-abortion rulings, all 100% unconstitutional, as the Constitution is silent on abortion. Where the Constitution is silent on power, it is prohibited of that power. If it doesn't speak of it, it's prohibited. President Clinton is a firm believer in infantile, and like the good socialist he is, supports abortion with all the might of his administration. It is interesting that the first time abortion clinics were thought of was when Mr. Lasky's wife, Professor Lasky of the Fabian Society, began to establish birth control clinics in England. Mrs. Lasky's tactics employed the methods of the notorious communist commissaire Konrad Alexandria Kollontai, Kollontai. When socialists were confronted and exposed and advanced the cause of communists by different tactics, they protest loudly. But the old saying, wound a communist and a socialist bleeds, was never truer than it is today. What we have in the United States is a secret upper level parallel socialist government known as the Council on Foreign Relations that was set up in 1919 by arch socialist Mandel House and Walter Lippmann under the direction and control of the RIIA in London. Many times we see stories in the press about open disagreements between communists and socialists. This is done to deceive the unwary and keep in line those who have been duped into believing that progressives and liberals and moderates really mean something other than what the socialist meaning is. Thus, they are able to keep in line a vast number of people who would otherwise recoil in shock if they knew they were promoting the aims of a world revolutionary government. That our new president, accused of being a philanthropist, a libertine lacking in morals, and acceptable to millions of Americans who are not socialists, is a triumph for the methods of Fabian socialists. Folks, if you don't have any morals, you don't have any idea what right and wrong is, you don't deserve to be a parent. Do you understand that? This is my point. If you don't understand that, what in the world are you doing? Because you're destroying something precious later on if you and the woman get together and decide to have a child. And frankly, if you don't have that responsibility, you shouldn't be married or even being dealt with that issue. Shame on you. Their methods are so subtle that their goals are not always at first recognized. Lately, there have been much discussion, much of it low caliber, showing the probability of an understanding of a united constitution among the majority of senators about line item veto, supposedly a right of the president. This is pure socialism, anti-constitutional propaganda, and a continuation of the process started by the socialists during the Wilson presidency of surrendering the rights that properly belong to the legislation to the president. You see, what we got now is no longer a president, folks. We've got a king. You see, and you got to get this to your head. Trump is just as bad as Biden. There's not really a damn bit of difference here. He just uses different forms of speech to make you feel good. When in reality, he's no better. You see, what Biden does is more out in the open, but still they both are moving the same thing down the field, folks. There's not a damn bit of difference between the two of them. If you do think that, you lost your fucking mind. Because there's not a damn bit of difference between them. Because they're working. One may be out here doing such and such, and it's behind doors. The other one's out here front telling you such and such. Which one is the most dangerous? I'll tell you which one is the most dangerous. It's the one that's doing something back behind the bushes here, folks. Not the one out there saying something, because you know what he's doing. But the problem simply is that we don't need any authority, you see, if we choose to be the absolute authority ourselves. But we've forgotten that, enormously have. We're the ones are the credit of this country, folks. We are the ones who actually, it's our country, not theirs. It's ours, not theirs. Get that through your head. So few people don't seem to see that. They give up, which is what they want you to do. It's back to the book here. It is the goal of the socialists to give the president powers that he has not got, nor is entitled to, so that they can proceed to steamroll the Constitution out of the way of their new world order plans. The socialists want the president to have veto powers, not granted by the Constitution, in so-called enhanced recessions. It's typical socialist fashion. They do not come right out and say it. We want the president to be able to veto any parts of the bill that has passed the House and Senate, you see. This is what it means by line item veto. So he doesn't like one thing he does, he just pushes it out. And why in the world would the Congress do that reveals that they are also gullible, are doing the same thing. The suffragists follows Florence Kelly's directives that change must be eared out by the legislative route if they cannot be done by the constitutional means. As we see elsewhere in this book, Professor Howard Lasky devoted a great deal of his time to discussion with Felix Frankfurter, that is the Supreme Court Justice, and President Roosevelt, how to subvert the Constitution provisions that the powers of each branch of government granted by the Constitution cannot be transferred. Lasky is frequently lashed out as the stumbling block to promote socialism via the legislative route. The shocking hypocrisy of the socialists is revealed in their insistence on the so-called separation of church and state, idea of being strictly enforced. Apparently, what is sauce for the goose is not sauce for the gander. To turn this kind of power over to the president is an act of suicide. It's quite possibly treason. The real issue here is power and how the socialists can grab more and more of it via the servant of their own whims, whom they place in the White House. There's nothing more dangerous than a socialist drive to turn over to the president powers reserved to the House and Senate. This would produce Super Wilson, Roosevelt's, Bush's, and Clinton's, and rush the United States headlong into a socialist dictatorship, which we practically have already. Line item veto powers would become a party politics wrangler, intimidate the lawmakers whom the states have returned to the bidding of the powers, not federal government. Line veto, sir. Future tires, even worse than George Bush, whose private war for on behalf of the British crown cost the lives of hundreds of Americans and cost $200 billion. It's probably and that's and then obviously when they go back and do it again under his son. You see, line item veto powers for the president would be a great triumph for Florence Kelly. Line item veto powers for the president would throw the House and Senate into confusion, paralyze their efforts, and generally hasten a breakdown of government in this country. All declare socialist aims. Tensions and passions between the legislative branch would boil over and make Congress totally subservient to a belligerent president hell bent on following the socialist agenda. Correct. It would make of the Constitution of the United States a blank piece of paper with checks and balances reduced to a smoking ruin. This nation has suffered far too much already from socialist excesses of presidents that have installed, such as Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Johnson, Carter, Eisenhower, Bush, and Clinton. These presidents have rushed the nation to deadly wars in which we should never have become involved in, at the cost of millions upon millions of lives, not to mention the billions and billions of dollars they were generated, billions that went to the Wall Street, the City of London bankers, the Bank of International Settlements, and the World Bank, etc., for which the people are still being taxed. And also, when I'm not saying awful, but the defense industry, which is probably one of the biggest industries now in this country. That's a red flag, folks, because that's what the Soviet Union did. Their biggest expenses were eventually to the military themselves. That's why their whole social structure, their whole economy completely fell apart because they spent all their money on the military. Line item veto powers plus the illegal so-called executive orders will make a future tyrant president of the caliber of Roosevelt and Bush a king as surely as if the title had been bestowed upon them. To give the president constitutional power to line item veto bills of Congress would require an amendment to the United States Constitution. Correct. It never was, folks. See, if you want to change the stinking Constitution, if you want to do that, okay, then you have to go for the correct procedures, folks. They never required amendment, you see. They just do it by stealth, little by little. The three departments cannot legislate or by any other means transfer duties or powers or on another division of government. The founding fathers wrote this provision to stop would-be tyrants from seizing power by this method. If you want an example of tyranny, we should look no further than what took place at assault on a particular church in Waco by the federal government in total violation of the United States Constitution. There were 87 people murdered at Waco. The Tiananmen Square massacre, that is a socialist media description of the event, killed 74 Chinese. Yet Clinton was prepared to cross swords with China over his human rights violation occasioned by Tiananmen Square uprising against the Beijing government. But this as far has done nothing to bring the perpetrators of Waco to justice. This is typical hypocrisy of true socialism. Where in the United States Constitution does say that the federal government has to rush into states and persecute a religious group. It is not there. The federal government has no business meddling in the states, especially when it comes to police powers. The 10th Amendment is perfectly clear on this. Police powers and health, education, and police protection belong exclusively to the states, period. If the branch Davidians had perchance committed any crime that warrant police actions against them, that action should have been taken by the local police and no one else. The sheriff department at Waco failed immensely in its duty to protect the Davidians inside their church property. They stepped to the side, didn't take their responsibility because someone came along and says, we're a bigger boy than you, and you need to move out of the way. The federal government once again displayed its arrogant attitude towards the United States Constitution by violating Article 1 of the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution, which states, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peacefully assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. What happened at Waco was that the federal government took powers it does not have and went to Waco with expressed intentions of prohibiting the free exercise of religious beliefs, freedoms of expression. This is secular humanism in action, which has no place in our Constitution. The socialists are very hot on the separation of church and state when it suits their book. What happened to separation of church and state in Waco, though, it was not there. You see, what's good for them isn't good for you, you see. The federal government decided it could simplify religion, which is complex subject that defines simplification on page E7151, Congressional Record House, July 31st, 1968. Judge Douglas put the matter this way. It is impossible for government to draw a line between good and bad. Okay. And to be true to the Constitution. Better to let such ideas alone. Instead of listening to its own socialist judges, the federal government decided it has the right to decide between a good religion and a bad one. Government agencies on the ground at Waco took it upon themselves to oversimplify the complexity of religion. Experience through the centuries has shown that religion cannot be simplified. No, it can't. Moreover, it lies outside of political issues and was never supposed to be simplified. The first 10 minutes of the United States Constitution are a restriction on the federal government. That's what it's about. Because the federal government is centralized power, you see. And they're a threat to the rest of the states or in the local, everything. But a lot of that's also, he doesn't go into, I'll share this with you. This country is not actually a country anymore, folks. It's become a corporation, you see. In addition to Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution denies federal government any right to pass legislation on religious matters. The primary power of the House and Senate are found in Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 18. Remember, the federal government has no absolute powers, you see. The federal government has zero right to decide what is a church and what is a cult. Apparently, government agencies on the ground at Waco made this determination with the assistance of a cult deprogrammer of one kind or another. The whole idea of such action is repulsive, not to mention downright illegal. Why would someone, this is what really bothers me. This is what you need to think about if you're in a power position. Would you go and kill your neighbor because he has a different religion you do? Have you come to that point, folks? Have you? Have you come to that point that the money is more important, or prestige, or whatever it is, till you would kill other people for that? My, oh my, we fell apart. We've lost our virtue, folks. You can quit that job, you see. You can quit because you're actually causing harm to someone else. And you will reap that karma in your life, folks. You will. No matter who you are, you will reap it. But the federal government, to have this power, which it does not, would be to grant it all power to destroy any and all religions, a plank in the socialist program, one of the goals of world revolution. This power is not in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, nor is it found under the delegated powers of Congress or the primary powers of Congress in Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 18. When the United States Constitution is silence on my power, it is a prohibition of that power, you see. So where do the FBI and the ATF, the alcohol, tobacco, firearms get their power and allow them to attack a Christian church or anybody, folks, not just a Christian church? Apparently from the president and the attorney general, neither of whom has such powers. And since they both admitted responsibility for the dreadful deed at Waco, they ought properly to be impeached. Most Americans died at Waco. There were more Americans died at Waco than the Chinese students at Tiananmen Square. Did the jackal press of the United States call the Chinese students a cult? Of course not. Neither does the federal government have the right to call a Christian movement a cult. The United States Constitution was compromised by the action of the federal government at Waco. The United States Constitution cannot be compromised, folks. No government agency is above the Constitution. And the federal government agencies that took part in the Waco attack broke the law. They have no constitutional right to intervene in a matter that fell within the purview of the state of Texas. It was not in the purview of the federal government. The federal government talked of the Branch Davidians as terrorists. You remember that? They used the media to do that. You remember Mr. Hightower? You remember him? One of the people key there on the ground? I do. What a shame. But should not have had any say in making such a delineation. That was the state of Texas position, folks. Nowhere in the Bill of Rights has the federal government the authority to call a Christian church a terrorist organization. Authority for the attack of Waco is not found in Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 18. It would have taken a constitutional amendment to endow the federal government to launch a armed attack on the Branch Davidian Church in Waco. To properly understand the horror of Waco, one has to read the Declaration of Independence, wherein it found that a recital of acts of brutal perpetrated against the colonists by the King George, that is, the third. But yet we have King George in Waco, or worse. Congress, you see, he's supposed to be American, you see. The Congress, the House, and the Senate has the power to right that's wrong. They can order a full-scale congressional hearing. Congress can also cut off funding for those federal agents that took part in the modern-day King George III attack on the citizens of the United States. Articles of impeachment are urgently necessary. The Congress has to take most of the blame. The federal agents who took part in the storming of the Branch Davidian Church probably thought they were acting under authority of the law when they were not. Congress is supposed to know this, and Congress is supposed to correct that situation, lest it be perpetrated somewhere else. Birch Bayh, B-A-R-C-H-B-A-Y-H, a socialist former senator from Indiana, I remember him, was used by the Fabian Society to undermine the Constitution of the United States, and he did so at every opportunity. He was a very liberal senator. As a reading of page S16610-S16614, Congressional Record, Senate clearly establishes, where does it say in Article 1, Section 8 of the delegated powers of Congress that the federal government has the power to use military vehicles to attack a church? That's tyranny, folks. That's plain and simple. That's tyranny. And you can't see that. You maybe need to watch the whole thing with the Branch Davidians and what took place. I'm not saying I agree with what they did, Branch Davidians, but there was none of the business of the government involved. The federal government had no business at all in that whole situation. Why were their tanks used? It looks like there's a war going on here upon the people, doesn't it? Clinton's administration is a pretty dark past, folks. Where does it say that the federal agents are empowered to call a church a cult? This attack on the Christian Church Branch Davidians is a violation of the First, Fourth, Fifth Amendment and is a bill of attainder of United States citizens as Waco. Neither legislative, executive, or judicial branches of the federal government has the right to call a Christian church, nor for that matter, any church simply by calling a cult. Since when has the federal government has the power to decide on their complex religious matters? It doesn't. Since when can the federal government exercise the bill of attainder? It can't. What the federal government did at Waco was to take a complex religious matter and turn it into a simple matter of a cult it did not like. No, it's a little bit more than that. They just simply wanted to use their power to demonstrate their power in front of the people and show it on television. That's how bad it was. The executive branch in Article 2 of the United States Constitution has no power to attack what the President and the Attorney General called a cult. This is not the first time that the federal government has launched an attack on a religious group it did not like. It is an excuse to simply say that the President and his Attorney General take the responsibility for breaking the law. Pages 1195 to 1209, Congressional Record, Senate. That is February 16, 1882. We see that the Senate tried to act like God in appointing a 5-man commission to prevent Mormons from voting simply because they were Mormons. This was a gross violation of a bill of attainder. The only saving grace about this ugly piece of history is that there was a debate in the Senate. The victim of the federal government at Waco had no such right. On the efforts to block the Mormons from voting, and we find it in page 1197, and this is highly relevant to the Waco attack. We read that that right belongs to American civilization and law long before the Constitution was adopted. This right existed in colonial times, like the right to bear arms, and those rights were made a part of the Constitution through a series of amendments, in addition to those in the original instrument. They stood for the protection of rights. They were merely a guarantee of rights that already existed before the Constitution, which was not the creator of the rights itself, you see. What the federal government did at Waco was no very different from the type of action advocated by the international socialist Karl Marx, which the Chinese government observed at Tiananmen Square. The citizens who died in the blaze at Waco were not given their constitutional right to a fair trial and due process of law as stated in the Fifth Amendment. So are we a communist society or socialist? Well, definitely we're socialists. You can see that. Continue to read from Congressional Record, Senate, February 16, 1882 on page 1200. For example, no one, we presume, will contend that Congress can make any law in a territory respecting the establishment of religion or free exercise of, or abridge freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people of the territory peaceful to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. Nor can Congress deny the people the right to keep and bear arms, not the right to a trial by jury, not to compel anyone to be a witness against himself in criminal proceedings. Yeah, they don't do the trials hardly anymore with a jury, do they? Get it? These powers in relation to the rights of people, which are not necessarily here to emanate, are in express and positive terms denied to general governments, and the right to private property have to be guarded with equal care. What happened at Waco was unhindered socialism in action, grossly flouting the United States Constitution, since it is clear that neither the Congress, the House or Senate, nor the judicial branch, nor the executive branch, the president had any constitutional rights whatsoever to order an armed attack on the Branch Davidian Church at Waco. The next question is, what is the Congress doing about writing this gross violation of the Constitution, and what is it doing to bring the guilty among the federal government to justice? This happened in 1993. It will be 30 years this year, April the 9th. 30 years. In a socialist Marxist state, Waco would have been merely an exercise of government power. But the United States, to its constitution, is not a socialist Marxist state. It remains a confederated republic, notwithstanding the horrendous assaults upon it by the likes of Fabian socialists like Harold Laski, Felix Frankfurter, Hugo Black, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, George Bush, and now President William Jefferson Clinton. Waco was a cynical exercise of power not granted to the judicial or exercises branches of government, and appears on a level with its assessments of past concerning religious intolerance. Getting back to the attempts by socialists to transfer powers from one branch of government to another, even without line item veto powers, we already had a king instead of a president. I referred to King George Bush, who lust for power begat more power and more power until the nation was carried away on the flood tide of his mad power grab and landed in a war which was unconstitutional in the history of the United States. Again, did the quote unquote, did Iraq attack this country? No. Same thing. Did Germany attack this country? No. By people, one person doing this, it costs people's lives, folks. What has been entirely lost in the debate of the House and Senate as to whether to give the president such powers is that, being 100% unconstitutional, it would require amendment to the United States Constitution. Of course it does. The Congress does not have that authority to grant the president the line item veto powers. This cannot be done by the Congress, but only by way of constitutional amendment. The Founding Fathers meant to prevent the Constitution being circumvented by the three departments passing powers back and forth. Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution denies or severely limits the power of Congress to legislate. The Congress cannot pass its duties to the Supreme Court or the president without a constitutional amendment. This was meant to stop power-mad socialists like Wilson, Roosevelt, Bush from rushing the country into one war after another. But even that did not stop power-mad Wilson, Roosevelt, and Bush from doing just that, you see. Clinton awaited his chance to start another war. He narrowly missed out against North Korea, but his turn may yet come before his single term comes to end. Just to give you an idea how old this book is. The line item veto power is another step towards the socialist goal of making the United States Constitution of no effect. I doubt anybody even studies the Constitution in schools, folks. I even doubt that's even studied in college. The Constitution powers the president is found in Section 2 of the United States Constitution. He has no other power. The Fabian Society carried on a war that was lost by the armies of King George III. They provoked the Civil War and all wars since then. It is the hope of toppling the Confederate Republic of the United States. The annuals of Congress, Congressional Globes, and Congress records provide a wealth of information and detail to confirm this opinion. On page 326, the Congressional Globe, House, July 12, 1862, we find a speech by Honorable F.W. Kelly, Origins of the Rebellion. National pride has been gratified. Also, the increase of power and the certain knowledge that in the half a century more, the United States must be by far the most powerful nation on the globe. But the great powers of Europe have witnessed rapid growth with uneasiness and defend America, which was never any time threatened by the Germans. The mischief done by the modern day American socialists is tremendous. Jacob Jarvis saw it what he called civil rights issues, a golden opportunity to stir the racial waters by infiltrating the socialists in such key government bodies as the Equal Opportunities Commission. On the international scene, Jarvis used scare tactics at which socialists are so good, was responsible for establishing the so-called international bankers and then getting Congress to fund them in utterly unconstitutional manner. Another big promoter of socialism in the country was Judge Ab Fixer Fortas, F-R-O-T-A-S, who more than any other socialist was responsible for legalizing a flood of obscene literature and pornography. This was designed to further weaken the morality of the nation. Fortas cast the deciding vote in the U.S. Supreme Court, 100% wrong decision to allow pornography under the guise of freedom of speech. We are told by psychologists and psychiatrists that this led directly to a huge increase in crime as this kind of entertainment titillates the lower brain centers. House and Senate members must bear their share of the blame for this and the shocking rise of unemployment and crime in tandem. The House and Senate, by a two-thirds vote, can overturn any Supreme Court ruling, and they should have done this 10 years ago and not wait for the situation to get out of hand, and then stand by and allow the socialists in their midst to blame the problem on guns. There are some really red-hot socialists in the House and Senate. Representative Bill Richardson is a notable example. On pages E27 and 88 and E2790, that is Congressional Record, July 31st, 1991, Richardson launched forth a paean of praise for one of the worst socialists on America. Then Representative Stephen Solares, who interfered in the affairs of Rhodesia, South America, the Philippines, and South Korea, and every non-leftist country under the sun. If that were not bad enough, the investors looking into the House bank scandal found Solares had written the highest number by far of bad checks. By comparison with Solares, Benedict Arnold was practically a saint. Other socialist saints that have caused this country unlimited harm and caused a breakdown not only of our economy, political and judicial system, but who have actively sought to advance the socialist agenda to the detriment of the American people were Harry Dexter White, John Kenneth Galbraith, Arthur Schlesinger, Telford Taylor, Robert Strange McNamara, David C. Williams, George Ball, Venus Frankfurter, Bernard Baruch, Arthur Goldsberg, Alger Hiss, Judge Gesell, G-E-S-E-L-L, Ralph Bunch, Nicholas Kazenbaum, Cora Wise, Louis Brandeis, George Bundy, Henry Kistner, Alan and John Forster Dulles, Sam Newhouse, and Walter Whitman Bustow. Some of these and other socialist warriors would be found in the chapters Stars in the Socialist Firmament with the account of their deeds. Their plans and aims were to slowly and essentially induce the United States to adopt socialism. In each stage, they would not be noticed by the people. The program was one worked out by the Fabian Socialists of London as a detailed by the lead player, Professor Lasky, Graham Wallace, and Kenneth Galbraith. These plans were laid out in such a manner as to coincide or dovetail with what liberals were doing in America, especially in the fields of education, undermining the United States Constitution, the American system of political and economic based upon sound money and trade protective tariffs. There would not be any taxes, folks, for people here if the trade protective tariffs were there. The free trade is a misnomer, it's a lie. It's cost people lives, jobs, it's cost everything for the benefit of the major corporations in this country. So that they didn't want to have to pay people here, so they go across borders and like Mexico and build something and make it for a cheap labor when they steal from those people too. You see, these people are money hungry people. These largely coincided with the international socialist plans for eventual one world government, new world order. The Fabians of England to adjust their plans to American timetable was a big undertaking. How successful they were can be measured in terms of the fact that between 1920s and the 1930s, they almost succeeded in totally socializing the United States. So that concludes chapter 2 of the Socialist One World Order Socialist Dictatorship tonight. I didn't know it'd be that long, but I wanted to get it out and put it out there because truth needs to prevail. I may not agree with everything that John Coleman says here, but in reality, most of it is right. We have failed. And if you look around here in 2023, we're in a hell of a mess. We really are, especially what has happened the last 2 years in this country. So I appreciate you being here. Thank you for your attendance, and I wish you well. Um, so I, again, I'm sorry it's long. It's an hour and 45 minutes, but the key was simply is I wanted to get this out there. It's got to be important um, because truth must prevail. And my hopes is simply is, and what I do for this is the seeds that I put out will eventually germinate. That's my hope. Because where are people going to go now? There's nowhere to go, folks, if you truly want to be free. Yes, I see someone's responded. I forgot. I thought you would talk about how old Abraham covered the original. No, I did not. The Committee of 300 runs this place. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Appreciate that. Thank you for listening. Again, thank you for being here. Again, this will be on my Facebook page. It will be on Odyssey, and it will be on my YouTube channel, Discerning What is True. All right. Wish you a good night, and you take care.